They are beautiful symbols of West Coast culture. The knitted sweaters, socks, gloves created by the Coast Salish people. During the Olympics, the Cowichan sweater had a prominent place on the world stage. In her book for children, Yetsa's Sweater, Sylvia Olsen followed the creation of a Cowichan sweater through the eyes of a child. Now, this weekend, the Victoria author is launching a new book for grown-ups, Working with Wool, a Coast Salish legacy and the Cowichan sweater. And Sylvia Olsen is here in our studio. Hi, Sylvia.
Hi, Joanne.
With all of the artists and all of the stories and the long history of the sweater, where do you start when you try and tell this story?
Oh, how do I start answering that question? It was a real challenge.
Yes.
To put it. It took me 10 years, more than 10 years to write this book. And I started many times and in many places. So the bigness of the story and the breadth and the amount of people that are involved in the story is daunting. But on the other hand, it is an exciting story that just needed to be told so badly that I worked it around and started and put it together as a chronological historical story. So that's what I ended up with.
Go back to sort of tell it in order. Kind of like a sweater. You unraveled it several times.
I unraveled it several times. That's right.
You talk about the beginning of the book in your own introduction, the language around telling the story and how difficult it is to use language. And at one point you say you will refer to it not just as the Cowichan sweater, but the Indian sweater. What allows those terms to be used in your mind?
It's difficult for me, having been in the world of these sweaters for more than 4 decades. And names come and go. Words come and go. Words have different meanings depending on different time periods. So this is a story that scopes 150 years, and words resonate differently at different time periods. So to talk about an Indian sweater in the 1920s makes perfect sense. And it was a beloved term for those sweaters. Now we've unpacked that word Indian, and people have different feelings about it, but it's extremely difficult to give that up, given that its historical resonance is still there. So I have worked very hard to make this work and to use the words respectfully and to explain the historical richness of these terms. And it's very difficult to bring modern terms and cast them backwards.
So let's talk then about the Indian sweater. How important was the Indian sweater to the Coast Salish people when they first had started trading them with the Europeans?
And as the words change, the meaning and the importance of the sweaters change. They began as just the best thing to wear in the wet, damp weather. They began as Sarah, I think, says in the story, something to knit for your husband when he's now thinking of European clothing to wear. They just fit perfectly. And then the settlers thought, my goodness, they fit us perfectly too. And so they grew. The sweaters grew, and they became different things at different time periods. And in the mid 20th century, they became just an icon for everyone. And by the 70s, they became a hippie symbol. So they shift, they change. It's a wonderful thing about the sweater.
You must have had a bit of a chuckle as you watched them become an Olympic symbol. And there was quite a bit of a controversy over whether the Hudson Bay had sort of co-opted the sweater, and then the agreement came with the Cowichan tribes to work that out. You must have just laughed and thought, oh, here it becomes a symbol of something else.
It is becoming a symbol of something else. And while there is still really deep and hurt feelings around the appropriation of the sweater in the book, I call that chapter the sincerest form of flattery, which Sarah Modeste sees it that way too often. That yes, we've been copied many, many times. And in the 70s and 80s, those fake sweaters really hurt the producers and hurt the business. They did some serious damage, which if you read the book, you'll get the whole story on that.
Yeah.
But in 2010, there is an amazing imagination in our minds of the architecture of the Cowichan sweater, and it's showing up everywhere. And at this point, one way of looking at it is that it's an amazing form of flattery to something that has embedded itself so deeply in every one of us. And to get a little Olympic comment in here. Yeah. The real disappointing thing about the Olympic, one of the real disappointing things about the Olympic approach to this is that they didn't raise this sweater up and say, this is one of BC's only, and it is definitely BC's best icon. And they could have just come out with that right away, and it would have been so wonderful. Because it is. What else do you think of? What can you, totem poles for sure. Yeah. And Cowichan sweaters.
Hard to take a totem pole home.
It is too. It is too.
What about your own connection to the sweater? How do you feel about the Cowichan sweater?
Well, I feel in a way that I'm telling someone else's story or many other people's stories. And I feel as if I'm telling all of our stories, because the Cowichan sweater, of course, is produced by Indigenous women in the Coast Salish territory, and it's their story. But as a very blonde white settler girl, moving onto the reserve when I was 17, I became just completely in love. I fell deeply in love with the work that the women were doing, and wore one and bought and sold them and repaired them, and was part of the world of Cowichan sweaters for many, many years. So my little piece of it is very much like all of our pieces of it. We fit in where we fit in. And then as a storyteller, I'm one of hopefully many people who tell this story. My story is one. It's the story from the vantage point where I sat.
Another thing that you weave throughout this book that is an interesting comment on what the sweater says about the nature of First Nations people. I mean, you talk so many times in this book about women who sat up all night and knit so they could feed their families, and at one point say, we have worked so hard. That seems to be an important message for you to get out.
It is an important message, although I don't see it so much as a message as just the way it was. When I moved onto the reserve in 1972, those were hard days on reserves, 1970. The 70s were not, and the 60s and the 50s were really tough days economically. And what I saw when I moved on to the reserve, and people say, oh, what was that like? Well, it was like I moved there, and here was all these women working all the time, creating these really, really beautiful garments. And as a 17-year-old girl, who was always handy, that struck me the most. The most was the hard work. But it wasn't until I was speaking to this beautiful knitter, a friend of mine, and she was recanting her history of being a knitter. And she looked up and said to me, wow, we Indians were sure hard workers, or are sure hard workers, aren't we? And we laughed. It's like, how ironic is that this story is about hard work. It's about love and it's about beauty, but at the heart of it, it's about working hard. And who sees that when they look at a sweater?
I can't let you go without saying this is a beautiful book, but you've got quite a launch planned on Sunday at the Art Gallery.
We do, and that's thanks to Sononis Press that does things amazingly. So we have the Art Gallery. We also, for that launch, we have 25 old, ancient sweaters from an amazing collection that Judy Hill and Duncan has just put together over the years of used sweaters. These come from people, not from knitters. They've gone through the gamut of being worn for 10, 15, 20, 50 years, 60 years. And we're going to display those. So for everybody who loves knitting, who has had a sweater, who is engaged with working with their hands, this is a real celebration. So wear your Cowichan knit, or wear anything that's knitted by your favorite knitter, and come and celebrate with us.
Sylvia, thanks so much.
Thank you.